I do know where you're going.
Yeah.
My son has been for 10 years. I think it's very family, very great deal. It's sad to say we're not related to anybody that you've ever heard.
His mother? That was the case. One of them got down to 1 inch across the Atlantic. That Delta you walked up to Trinidad or something, that oil stuff. And ping, one went out, ping, another went out, ping. It wasn't enough like that. Yeah.
And we were all
Yeah. But you know, if you want to take a But anyway, let me know if you want to order something, how soon. I did. I had it down the beach this weekend. Everything I did is, geez, I said, I'm going to take this. No, it's not now. My niece and my nephew they were the first airport. Did you remember Franklin Delano
Today I have a bunch of things going on today. Doing some laundry. And then I did my haircut. And
Oh my God, it takes this up. He had what happened? I didn't put up your battery. Just a little small. You don't want to
What's that? Oh, it's a draw. Yeah, I love it.
What happened to your Red Sox? Well, on your handmaking, right? Well, you know, they got one yesterday. You like the rough stuff? You like the rough stuff? You know, I didn't even know they had a different coat. They got a new one this year. Oh, I haven't been following much because it's not on the regular channels. And I get the Clyde cable. So I only get the highlights where I can watch it on, you know, as it's going on, it's like they follow. That's what I did with the Sox yesterday.
So whatever. I didn't go up there.
I don't know why they should have waited. They should have waited like today. Today's a nice day. The longer you keep those people there, the more they buy. There. You ready to sit down?
I will be at the big end.
I think he was good. I liked him in the Siege of Peking too. Wasn't a very good tennis player. I remember the movie. I remember the movie very well. How these barons movies give us a lot of history. Sometimes it's fanciful, but it's probably better than not having It's been a while, I can't remember.
Did a lot of work.
Nervous? No. I can sit through a few softball questions. No, I just don't have anything, you know, it's really serious and then nothing too complicated. Looking forward to it.
And it's, because they had furniture.
Hi, everybody. Is this on? It is now. I usually give you a 2-minute warning, and I got carried away. It's 1:15. So, okay. So I guess we're going to start. No 2-minute warning. You're all seated and you're ready for the program. So I will get my notes out and we will begin. So let me just give a signal. Hey, Pat, while you're up, would you just let the folks out there know that we're starting? All right. Good afternoon and welcome to the 260th consecutive meeting of the Lexington Veterans Association. I'm Linda Dixon, and I'm so happy to welcome you all on behalf. This is not working.
No, just started.
Ed says, he says, keep talking. It's now working. Very well. All right, first thing we will do is please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance. And look who's standing right here. Mr. Bill Stern, who will, hello, will you? Okay, Bill will lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you very much. I hope you've had time to enjoy the refreshments. Coffee compliments of Starbucks and Lexington Center. Thank you to all who've supplied baked goods. Thank you to all who've put a little donation in our basket. That's what we operate on. Haven't seen you in a while, Sally. Hello. And I would just like to introduce a new member of our executive committee, Jim Ramsey. Jim, why don't you stand up for a minute? Okay, give him a hand. We're going to have a red name tag for you any day, Jim. It just wasn't quite ready today. I'm sure Jim is a familiar face. He's been attending our sessions here for at least 4 years. He is a former naval officer. He had 5 years of active service, served as a company commander in Vietnam in the Seabees. Then stateside, he managed construction contracts and various public works. And it didn't take, I'm happy to say, very much arm twisting to ask him to join us. And he's already proved his worth. He's done a bunch of projects for us. And now on a much sadder note, we have lost 2 really loyal and steadfast members of our group. And they have served their country with excellence and with dedication. And I really must recognize them both. The first one is Jack Ryan. I'm sure we all know Jack Ryan. a veteran of World War II. Jack spoke to us. Gosh, I think it was 3 years ago. Time flies. He died on September 8 at the age of 92. He served as a staff sergeant and a B-29 gunner in the Army Air Force, and he participated in 26 bombing runs from the Marianas to Japan. We also lost John Rommelfanger, also a very loyal attendee and Lexington resident, and Bob Lewis. Bob, I would like to just offer a few words of remembrance. We're standing too close to the microphone.
So, John Rommelfanger was a Lexington resident. He was a Lexington Navy veteran of Vietnam. He died recently. He suffered from Alzheimer's disease. But John served aboard the aircraft carrier Ranger during Vietnam, building Sidewinder missiles as an electronics technician. He is proud of his naval service. And he parlayed his interest and experience in electronics, plus further post-Navy education, into a career as an engineer with Raytheon, working for a while on the Joint Expeditionary Force experiments, an effort to integrate the communications and information systems of the Navy, the Air Force, the Army, and Marine Corps. You know how important that was. He was a good husband, father, and recently a delighted grandfather. He acknowledged and was well aware that he was blessed to have a great caretaker, his wife Barbara. He was always a gentleman. You were very kind to him. And this group, Lex Vets, was very important to him. He came every month. You were a healthy influence for him, because it's an active and friendly group, and there's always some interesting talk. He enjoyed the meetings at the Lex Vets. He could no longer drive, so we picked him up each month and drove him, went to lunch with us and usually the speaker, and then after the talk, we drive him home. So my offer to you is, if any of you can no longer drive and you would like to be picked up, let us know. Perhaps we can accommodate that. Thank you.
Why don't we just observe a quiet moment of silence in memory of Bob and John. Thank you. Ed, what's the best place for me to stand? Back? Okay.
That one up there.
Okay, fine. I would now like to introduce Gina Rada, our Veteran Services Director, who will give the Veteran Services Report.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
We can all file claims for a ring in our ears with the VA now. And I know someone who can help you. Anyways, I'm loud enough, I guess, if this isn't working. But the Veterans Breakfast is November 4th at St. Bridget's. And our tickets are available at the Community Center and Michelson's Shoe Store in the center. This year, tickets are free. So in the past, they've always been $5. This year, they're going to be free. And we'll accept donations at the door for any non-veterans. If they feel like donating, then they can. They certainly don't have to. But you still have to get a ticket. So make sure you remember to grab your tickets at, again, the front desk of the Lexington Community Center, Michelson Shoe Store, or there's a very small amount available at the Bedford COA if there's anyone here who lives in Bedford, and that's easier for you to get one there. So that's November 4th at 8:30 at St. Bridget's. So I hope to see you all there. That's all I have for today.
Thanks, Gina. And also, regarding Veterans Day, please mark November 11 which is a Saturday on your calendar. That's when the Town Celebrations Committee will sponsor our annual Veterans Day ceremony. There'll be a small parade for, oh goodness, I'm so embarrassed. There'll be a parade at 10:15, and the ceremony will begin at 11 o'clock in Kerreri Hall. We have an interesting program planned. There's a very enterprising high school history teacher, and he wants his students to know the meaning of Veterans Day, to meet veterans, to understand what it means to be a veteran, to be more involved in understanding what national service is all about. And he's working with us to engage his students to see how many of them might have a veteran in their family that they'd be willing to write about. And he's found several of them. One has a grandfather who served in World War I, and they have letters from him that she's working on. Another is a Korean student whose father or a relative served in the Korean forces. And we're hoping that they will write some essays and read them to us on Veterans Day. So that should be a really fine program. Also, we're working with the same history teacher to recruit a panel of veterans to go to the high school and talk to 150 students about their service and to just sit and take questions from the students. And our goal is to have the veterans represent a 50-year range of service from the Korean War to the Afghan War. And so we're quite thrilled that the interest that this particular teacher is taking to give our youth a little exposure to what it is to be a veteran. So anyway, we hope to see you at the Veterans Breakfast and a week later at the Veterans Day ceremony. Does anyone have an announcement of anything of interest that you would like to share with us at this time? Pat Costello.
Somebody just reminded me that the calendars are starting to float in the doors. So the VA hospital in Bedford is always looking for calendars for their patients. And if you have any, please bring them to the next meeting in November. This little blue box over here is always welcoming to stationery, calendars, and recent magazines. Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. Now, believe it or not, at this point, we are really looking for somebody who might have something to say, because somebody is on his way. Oh, no, that's Bob. There's a person, I understand, on his way from Lex Media production studio with a very important piece of production equipment, which happens to be a disc of some kind, without which we cannot begin the filming of our speaker. So he's on his way, he's en route. We fully expected him 15 minutes ago. So I don't tap dance very well.
Oh, there's a lot of rope construction going
We
on.
need to fill about 5 more minutes until he gets here. Ed has something to say.
Just to buy some time. How many people use the web page? Go to the web page. How many people have never seen the web page?
A couple.
This is the web page. That's what's on it. That's one piece. As you go back and you opened up that web page, you're going to see today's event. This, of course, is not as exploded up as you'd like to see it. Dear Bob. I was going to go further into this webpage. Every one of our recordings that happen here for all of our speakers goes into the library upstairs, so you can go in and check out the DVD of this event in another 2 weeks for this particular one. Okay. That goes all the way down by different wars, as you can see. It eventually gets to the point where it'll give you a description of what you're looking for, so you can actually just go in and check that out. What our ultimate goal is, you're going to do this from home, so you can actually watch it on cable TV. That's the long-term goal right now, which I expect to happen before this year's out, to tell you the truth. Okay. We go further into this webpage. Yes, this kind of tells you a little bit about us, our mission statement, our purpose. And on going down, of course, it's not blowing up as high as you'd like to see it. Different connectivities to different people like Linda, myself, Lex Media, so on, so on. That'll give you a little bit of a go-to for contact information. Veteran Benefits, which is a brand new one. We're hoping to put something on there with the help of Gina and others. And whenever we really come up with something we just don't want to get rid of, this is trying to search for it now, are all photos of past events, past speakers, videos, such as the one that's here, and so on. This one here was the Kennedy Library production that you see down here, the John F. Kennedy, PT 109, and so on down. This is one of my favorites with the one-man submarines during World War II. So let's kind of give you an idea. That's what the webpage is all about. So if you miss something, you can still get it. So feel free to always go for that. And it's Lex, L-E-X-M-A, that's VETS.org.
And, don't go away. No. If anybody in this audience has any experience with websites, content management, Ed is our webmaster, so he's terrific on managing the web. But content management, coming up with ideas for things we can put up there, not necessarily writing it all, coming up with brand new original stuff, but finding interesting things that already exist that would be useful to our members. Boy, we'd love to have your help because, that's a lot of work, but we've got the infrastructure for it. And so if anybody has any thoughts on that, we'd love to hear from you.
You can have it back.
Okay, I can have it back.
I'm just going to go out and make a phone call.
All right, he's going to make a phone call. In the meantime, I'll introduce our speaker, so you'll be able to get to know Bob Leach, and who knows, Terry and the disc will walk through the door at any minute. So we'll be prepared. So, Dr. Bob Leach spent his career as an orthopedic surgeon, but he always had a passionate interest in military history. And no wonder, wait a minute, he grew up in Sanford, Maine during World War II. And the entire town was involved in supporting the war effort. His father and 4 uncles served in the war. As a boy, Bob was an airplane spotter, and he could recognize every Japanese aircraft ever built. I don't think any flew over the house, but boy, he was ready, just in case they ever did. He papered his bedroom walls with maps from National Geographic, and he had a huge collection of toy soldiers. I think you said your father was British, and when your relatives came over from England, they kept bringing you more toy soldiers. Bob served in the U.S. Navy from 1962 to 1965 as a doctor and a surgeon in the Naval Hospital in San Diego, caring for wounded Vietnam troops. In 1965, he began his practice at Leahy Clinic. He later founded and managed the orthopedics department at Boston University Hospital, where he spent the rest of his career. He's a specialist in sports medicine. He was the orthopedic physician for the Boston Celtics, and he was the head physician for 3 U.S. Olympic teams. Now, it's kind of interesting how he came to the subject he's going to talk to us today, but he will explain how he came to it. But Bob will talk to us today about Britain's 20-year campaign to maintain control over the Suez Canal, which was their key to trade with India, which was the jewel in the crown of the British Empire. And they were going to maintain control over that canal at all costs. So Britain fought local insurgencies in Egypt and the Sudan, which they just couldn't seem to put down. They grew, they festered, they just kept on getting bigger, and finally they culminated in a major battle. Ed is thumbs up. What's happening? And a decisive victory for the British. Now, the Sudan Campaign is interesting because it had a profound effect on what would later happen in the 20th century and beyond. And that's what's so interesting about what Bob is going to talk about. We're good. Okay, cool. First, it profoundly affected the way the British thought about how to fight a war in the future. It put Egypt in a pivotal position when World War II came along. And it really influenced the future balance of power in the Middle East, the results of which we are looking at to this very day. So, excuse me.
Before you do that intro, this is exactly what I was talking about before. We just turned on cable TV. We're live. So we're not even recording here right now. So the thing I wanted by the end of the year is now happening. So we're right at Lex Media to go on cable. We don't even need a disc.
So I bring you live and in person, Bob Leach. Give him a big hand.
Thank you, and thank you, Ed. Without him, we wouldn't have had this. It's a pleasure to be here. It's kind of fun to talk about something a little bit out of your expertise, although I've read a lot about it. Does not make you an expertise, it just means you've read a lot. I'm not a historian. I do enjoy history. I'm old enough that I've now lived through a lot of history, and I now realize that we really should value the past, and I recognize that much better than I think most of the world leaders do. I wish they would learn a little bit more from history. So we are, in fact, going to talk today about the Sudan Campaign, ending in the Battle of Omdurman. It would be Britain versus the Mahdists, whom they labeled dervishes, so I'll use both terms. And we might call it commerce versus ideology. First question, where the heck is Omdurman? Okay, second question, why should I care? The first one's pretty easy to answer. There's Cairo, Mediterranean, Red Sea, and Khartoum and Omdurman are next to each other. 450 miles by the crow flying. Wouldn't get a lot to eat all the way down. It's mostly desert. Long ways away. The Blue Nile joins the White Nile at Khartoum and Omdurman, and where they meet here, the Great Nile River goes. So it's a long way
from most things. Answer 2, why do I care? Well, you didn't have anything else to do this afternoon, so that's one reason. But aggressive commerce, the British, can lead to war. And people will fight for causes they believe in, the dervishes, etc. So there are those answers. I'd like to start with this quote from Santayana, which I know all of you know. Those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. During this time, Queen Victoria was the Queen of England. She reigned for a long period of time. Isn't that amazing? You always see pictures of her when she's an old lady, and I always thought it'd be nice to see her when she was younger. She's here pictured with her husband, Prince Albert. Prince Albert died very young. They had 9 children, by the way. And by the way, they were first cousins. No problems, however. But she was very happy then, not so happy afterwards. She was a powerful sovereign, yet she had no real power. She had influence. She was respected. She was loved. She would implore her ministers to do her bidding. But power was in the parliament, and the power was trade. Little bit of a country, big, big factor in the world. And trade was it. That, of course, made the Navy preeminent. The crown jewel in their trade was India. She called herself the Empress of India. There was, by the way, no emperor. There were a lot of rajas, etc., but she liked India. The easiest way to get there was go down to the Mediterranean and then go through the Suez Canal and up to India. So it made the Suez and that area exceedingly important for the English. For those of you who might not remember all you should about the Suez Canal, here we have the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, the Sinai. Cairo is here. Alexandria is there, and the Suez Canal is right here. We're going to have Khartoum and Omdurman down in this area where the Sudan is. And by the way, when all of this is going on, a lot goes over into Abyssinia because the British had influence there. They had a couple of ports for refueling, etc. So the Red Sea and all of that area was very important for Britain and for commerce. Gladstone was the PM in 1880, 87. He was in and out. He thought the Sudan was a total waste of time. No commercial prospects. Why do I care? He delayed rescue efforts for General Gordon. You might ask, who is General Gordon? He was known as Chinese Gordon. He started, when we know something about him, as an English Army colonel. Well thought of, did well in various battles, so well that the Empress of China asked him to come over there and organize her army, which he did, and he did quite well. He then came back and was put in charge of the Egyptian army and their training for a period of time. Then he went home. By the way, he was an unusual guy, rather ascetic, and eventually ended up going to the Sudan as the commander-in-chief, and he's the one who they are going to try to rescue. Kitchener is the major force in this battle. Young officer, he was in on the Gordon rescue attempt. They failed. This affected him greatly. Eventually became the Egyptian administrator, finally commander-in-chief, and because of battles won, he becomes known as Lord Kitchener. The Mahdi. The Mahdi was an ordinary man for a number of years, but he apparently was very charismatic, very, very religious. The Mahdi means guide. He didn't say he was replacing Muhammad. He said he was the conduit to get to Muhammad. And he was able to take all of these factions, and there were many of them in the Sudan in that area, and bring them together into a relatively powerful force. I'm going to divide this into 3 phases. 80 to 85 is phase 1. An Egyptian revolt led by Colonel Arabi. Generals don't revolt. They're in charge. They don't have to revolt. It's always colonels. Think of your history in Egypt, and you'll remember some more, including Nasser. Mahdi uprising in the Sudan during this time. General Gordon in 84 goes to Khartoum to take over and teach those rascals a lesson. Gladstone delays a rescue mission because Gordon has been begging for help via telegraph and up the Nile and by messenger, and Gladstone says no. Finally, the Queen says, you got to go get him, and they do, and it's too late. Khartoum is overrun, Gordon dies. The Mahdi died just a few months later of natural causes. So 2 of the factors here are already gone. Egyptian revolt, pretty easy. Send the Navy. And the Navy, which was obviously the best in the world at that time, they went to Alexandria, their new ironclads. They bombed the heck out of Alexandria, killed a number of people. Then they sent them over to the Suez Canal, loaded some troops off, and very quickly the revolt is over. Tel El Kabir is the only battle, and at that time there was a very quick strike, well led by the British, very well fought, particularly by the Scottish troops and by the Bengal Lancers. England's a small place. If you had all your troops just out of England, you wouldn't have much of an army. So as you well know, the Scots, some Irish, some Welsh, and many other countries, particularly out of India, became the people who comprised the, quote, British Army. The Mahdi had various tribes and groups. They weren't of his own particular persuasion, but they were people who listened to him. Many numbers, this creates problems. He's chief here, he's chief here, he's chief here, he's chief here. Not a grouping together that's as easy as the British had. Now, Gladstone delays and Gordon dies. Gordon died in January of '85 after having begged for many months to have a rescue mission. They did come eventually, but they were late. It's difficult to get things going in that area, and it's not like now. You didn't get in an airplane and fly over. It took time, and they got there a few days after he was killed, but it was a total failure. Gladstone's government fell because of that. It was a big deal. In Britain, it was a big deal. It was in all the newspapers. But this is the New York Tribune, and you will notice the Red Sea here, and obviously since we're talking about it, you can figure out they're talking about Gordon dying in Khartoum. I think 99.99% of the readers of the New York Tribune had never heard of the Sudan. But isn't it interesting that it would be all the way here and be big news, but it was very big news in England. Phase 2, 85 to 96. Egypt was stabilized because they had sent troops who stayed on when they went on the rescue mission. Sudanese and Egyptians were trained. Railroads, which had been put in the upper part of Egypt primarily for trade, going from the Suez Canal and the Mediterranean and so forth, were then built down to the south. So now you could go south with troops and supplies. In the meantime, the Khalifa, who has replaced the Mahdi, is running amok. He's got a lot of troops and he's running all over. And by the way, they are battling with Egyptian troops, Sudanese troops, and some English troops, and by and large, they're doing very well. The Egyptian border is actually threatened. Because of that, Kitchener is appointed Sirdar, which means Commander-in-Chief, because the new PM had had enough. This is the railroad system. Cairo's here, Alexandria here, Port Said and the Suez Canal here, but they eventually build a railroad which will go down here. And that is sort of the beginning of when they're going to be able to bring supplies down in that area. The British had two possibilities of bringing supplies. One was via the Red Sea over here through their port called Suakin, which was one of several along the Red Sea that they just kind of went in and took over. But it would have been much easier to come down the railroad. Why not the Nile? Cataracts. The Nile is not navigable all the way. This area and there, bad cataracts, you couldn't send people down. You sort of had to let them get off here and walk. So when the railroad came down, suddenly you were able to do something. One other thing that contributed to this, European intrigue. Kind of interesting, you read about all that went on in the 1880s to 1910. The Italians were in East Africa, trying to take over in a way. They lost to the inhabitants in the Battle of Adawa or Adwa. The French, who had been in West Africa, eased into southern Sudan in a place called Fashoda. They were trying to get in a bit there. After the Battle of Omdurman, Kitchener goes down and puts short shrift to that. Belgians in the Congo looking to expand. Germans looking to build an empire anywhere. As most of you know, they went south by a far. English is always wary. It's about trade. The more people you're competing with, the worse it is. It's, you know, kind of like having Walmart not wanting to have anybody else around. This, plus the threatening activities at the Egyptian border, pushed the PM to make Kitchener Egyptian Sirdar. I don't know how many of you know a Sirdar, but to me that looks like a real Sirdar, I think, there. I kind of wondered what the medals are for, because at this point, he's not had any battles, hasn't won anything. But maybe he was one of the world's great administrators and they gave things for that. So there he is. Phase 3, several years, 96 to 98. Kitchener, like Montgomery at El Alamein, remember, El Alamein, he built up and built up and built up, finally had overwhelming force, more tanks, and he won. Kitchener was of the same ilk. There's no reason for him to really hurry here. The idea is win. And if it takes you a little longer, okay, it does. It's already a number of years since Gordon's been killed. The Sudanese and Egyptian troops were well trained, and this was really important. Supplies were built up, new gunboats were made in England, shipped via the canal down to the railroad, and brought down on the Atbara River, where they're put together, and they served as floating gun platforms. Very important. He began to move his troops south in 98. And he's moving them down. A lot's going on. The Caliph and his men are kind of wondering what's happening. They're over there at Khartoum and Omdurman. He's only got about 80 to 85,000 people over there. They're really milling around trying to figure what to do. So finally, Kitchener is helped by the fact that a victory on the Atbara River, and we'll talk about that. He then moves not too quickly onto Omdurman. Intelligence. You would have thought it would be easy for the Arabs, Mahdi, dervishes, etc., to get intelligence. They had cavalry and they had camels. The fact is, they weren't good at it. They weren't good at getting it, they weren't good at interpreting it, and they never seemed to know where anybody was. Now, I don't know that any people here fought in the desert. I know not World War I or in World War II, but you know, it wasn't an awful lot better during that time. Now it's a little bit easier, got things in the sky. But it was not easy, and intelligence was bad for them. It was tougher for the British. Basically what they did was they had gold. So they would go and get someone and ask to pay, but then they knew he would go and tell someone else. So intelligence was a major problem for both sides. But this man, Mahmoud, helped Kitchener a great deal. He was over there at Omdurman, had about 20,000 or so of his own people. The Hadendawa were very good troops, and he had the Baggara horsemen. They were thought to be very good fighters. He wanted to do something. His tribesmen were restive. They didn't have good intelligence. They knew that the British had come down to this area, to the Atbara fort, but they didn't know how many, where else were they going, etc. They, as I said, had beaten the British in a number of battles. They weren't scared of the Brits. They thought, heck, we've seen them before. We've done well. So they weren't afraid. He felt that his horsemen would do very well because they were fierce and had done well in other battles. So he wanted to prove his worth, and frankly, the Khalifa was happy to see him do that. So Mahmud moved from the Nile down here from Omdurman up here and across the river. Sends out people, and they find that the British are somewhere around, but they don't know how many, and they don't know exactly where they are. What he does think is, I've got them outnumbered, and that's good. He also thinks, maybe what I should do is induce the British to attack me instead of me attacking, because it had always been the Arabs attacked the British. They've been successful at it frequently, but now he wants to do something different. I want to speak about the British Square. You all know about it. It was particularly during the Napoleonic Wars, row 1, row 2, row 3. First row fires, second's getting the guns ready, third row is now ready, and you got continuous fire. Also, as many of you know, horses will not charge a massed group of men. They will go up to it and usually stop. particularly if they're bayonets. So this is a good defensive position. I did not know till some years ago when I got interested that not only did they use this for defensive position, but even when they were in the desert marching around, they marched in a square. And they kept the baggage and so forth in the middle, and they marched up and down the desert in a square. By the way, about 7 years before this, it was broken one time by the Baggara horsemen, came in from behind, they went in the middle, got killed, and went back out. So they had one minor time when they did it. But again, they weren't scared of them. Okay, now we've got our troops there, and these are the Highlanders, who were a group that was fought in various of the campaigns there. This is before the Atbara battle. They fought at all three of these battles. And Mahmud builds his zareba, his defensive position. This is the Atbara River. He is on the west bank. The Brits are out here, Baggara horsemen, English, Egyptian cavalry, and here it is. Now, what is a zareba? It's nothing. It's thorn bushes and some rifle pits. And they don't really have firepower. So he's kind of sitting there in the desert, and he's saying, look at me, attack me. And the British are thinking, yeah, that's looking pretty good. And so the British didn't bother worrying about attacking this. It was set off at first by the Baggara horsemen, who were supposed to come around here and come back and attack the British, make them attack. What happened? The Egyptian and English cavalry behaved very well, and they fought them off. And at this point, all of a sudden, boom, they charged, and they literally went right through. The battle was over and done in less than an hour and a half. Less than an hour and a half. So this battle on the Atbara ends up with they charge. They had no firepower. I forgot to tell you, they also had cannons, and they're lobbing those in because there's nothing to stop them. So they're sitting there with the river behind, the English in front, lobbing cannons, and they're kind of thinking, this isn't working. And at the end of that, the Sudanese troops were particularly effective. A lot of dead, British dead, wounded, more Sudanese. And this happened frequently in the desert. If you lost and you were native, you went over to the other side, and they write about the fact that a number of the dervishes joined the Sudanese, were well trained. Why should they not? They were better paid, and they were better fed, they had better uniforms, so often they did do that. So at the end of this time, the Khalifa has lost a significant number of his troops. They've been made stronger, and by the way, the British at the time of this battle had between 9,000 and 10,000 troops. So, having done that, off we go. Well, no, not quite. That was in April of '98, and it's hot there. I guess it's hot all the time. And Kitchener says, we'll take the summer off and prepare again. So again, I understand it, although it's a little bit sort of frustrating to read it. But like Montgomery, he takes his time. He gets more troops, so he ends up with around 16,000 to 18,000 troops. He's well trained. They learned how to use their Hotchkiss guns, their Maxims, training here, some of the Indian troops. And at that point, he then is ready to make his move in August. What he does, he's over here on the Atbara. He's going to put troops on these old gunboats. They aren't very good. And he's going to go up here and come down to Omdurman. These gunboats were relatively poor. They were not good platforms for guns. But they were good at transporting troops. What he did was he took his British troops on the gunboats and around. He had his Sudanese and Egyptian troops and the war correspondents, which I thought was kind of cute. And they marched over via the desert to Omdurman. But in any event, he's now on his way to Omdurman. It's late August of '98. These are British troops that have disembarked, and they're now in Omdurman. By the way, these photos are all real photos. They're not, I'll tell you if they're lithographs or anything. These are actual photos taken at the time. They're available at various places. Firepower is Kitchener's byword. He's got it. He doesn't have as many people. His people are well trained. They have the new Lee Metford rifles, which have a clip of 7 to 9. If the Khalifa's men have any rifles, they're one shot and done. These are the new boats that he had made. They're put together, they come around, and they're ready to go with their Hotchkiss guns and their Maxims. Hotchkiss guns here. So he then does what I thought was pretty clever. He decides that he's going to use his floating firepower to induce the Khalifa's troops to attack him. He comes down to Omdurman and Khartoum, where there are several forts that have been built by the British years ago, but they're only small cannons, they're poorly manned, and he basically goes in this area and he bombs them, destroys the cannons, and they now become a non-factor. In the meantime, he's a major factor. He's sitting on the river, and he now starts bombing Omdurman. And there are some 65 to 70,000 troops still there, and he's lobbing shells in right there, and they can't feel too comfortable with that. Plus, the Mahdi's tomb is there, and he partially destroys the Mahdi's tomb. At that point, the Khalifa and his men are getting bombed. The Mahdi's tomb is being destroyed. They've been aching for a battle, and they say, let's get it on. And now Kitchener has exactly what he wants. He has a defensive position, his troops ready, and he's ready to go to battle. The Nile River, he's on the west side. This is his zareba, not significantly better than the one we saw beforehand. His British troops are here. Omdurman is over here, and he figured that would be the brunt of the troops coming there, and the secondary would be coming around here. This area in here has many Sudanese and Maxwell's brigade, which has cannons and machine guns. More Egyptians and some Sudanese up here. In this area, off the map, it's a place called the Kerreri Hills, a series of hills and valleys. Not too tall, 250, but it's an area you can look around. Over here is a place called the Surgham, another hill about 250. Points of reference and points to go and take a look. So as the battle's getting ready to go, Kitchener sends his lancers over here to look, and he sends his Camel Corps and his Egyptian cavalry over there to look around. And now they're waiting. Hotchkiss's brigade, these are taken on the day of the battle, just before the battle. Hotchkiss's brigade, these are the Sudanese troops here. He's ready to go. You have the Lincolnshire Regiment, the Surgham, the hill is over there. Notice the brambles, etc. Again, not a fortification of any significance. And then finally, coming all the way around, the Surgham's over there, we come all the way around. These are Sudanese troops, and they dug in and put something up, which I think I would have been inclined to do. In any event, they are now ready for the attack. The first attack is going to go something like this. There's your zareba. The hill is there. The Kerreri Hills are over there. The Khalifa sends his first group of troops directly here and a number of group here. Estimated 10, estimated 5 to 6 there. He's going to wait for them to go in and make things hot for the British, and then come around, and he's got these in reserve. He's got a lot of troops and everything. Now, the Kitchener has sent his Lancers out here to look for what's going on. 21st Lancers. They screw up. They never see this group. I don't know why. They did look over and see them, and they thought they saw more here. They came back and said, not much going on there, you got a lot in here. He then sent Broadwood over here. Broadwood looked, and he's an up and down here, so it's a little bit more easy to understand why he missed. He didn't see them, but he saw these troops here, fired on them. They came, they got angry, they came after him. He got on his horses and camels, came back, realized the camels couldn't go up and down hill well, so he sent them back in the zareba while he took his cavalry and took off north. And they took him out of action. So now we're waiting for the battle to begin. They're looking out, and this picture is kind of interesting. They look out and they see this black line. And apparently they discussed, gee, what is that out there? I wonder what that is. Oh my gosh, it's undulating, it's moving. And suddenly they realize these are the Khalifa's troops who are coming towards them. And some going slow, some going at a gallop, but there are a lot of troops. And I would imagine at that point, you probably would have thought, gee, I wish I'd doing something else. The first attack is right where we said, right up against the Sudanese, Maxwell, and over here, the British, right in through here. They're in reserve, they're in reserve. Broadwood has gone up there, and he has taken these troops up here and made them go here. This comes here, they don't get anywhere near close. The Lee Metfords are good at 800 yards. Their marksmanship is good. The cannons are going, the machine guns are going, and they're slaughtered. They have no chance. They're just slaughtered. At this point, the Sirdar, Kitchener, thinks, boy, we've got him. This is Broadwood, the man who took the cavalry. He had 400 troops, pursued by 6,000, etc. Goes all the way up, eventually takes him out of the battle. They finally get tired of running around after him. They go around the hills and they join the general retreat, because by then it is a general retreat. He did well. So at the beginning of the battle, they're slaughtered. We've been right here. And Kitchener says, go after them. I don't want them getting back to armed man and doing house-to-house fighting. I have no idea why he felt that way. There hadn't been any house-to-house fighting in the desert. It was all on the desert. But he was worried about it for some reason. So he said, advance. Everybody advanced. And they moved out. And at this point, without any question, he screwed up. He did not realize, because his information was not good, that these troops were here. He thought there was some here. But anyway, they're moving out and going there. At this point, it doesn't take a great deal to realize that this is a weak area. People writing about it afterwards, in particular, one correspondent said, Kitchener was very lucky. Kitchener says, no, my troops were very well trained and I acted appropriately. Because what he did was take these troops, bring them, turn them the other way, had them go over, had them come up, and he took a good defensive position again. This, incidentally, is the Sudanese troops as they're marching out, chasing after them at that time. So, in what would be termed the second attack, they have come around here, Khalifa's troops, they have come over here. They're met by MacDonald's Sudanese troops. They're met by the Lincolns. Lewis's troops have changed, they've changed. Kitchener, to his credit, realized what had happened, acted appropriately, and his troops were very well trained, and the Sudanese acted particularly well. So what could have been a major problem suddenly turns into just one more major slaughter. At this point, Kitchener's here with his troops. They're retreating. A number of the troops that were in this large Khalifa group never got close. They were slaughtered. They went back. They're continuing over. Everything is well in hand. Kitchener continues to go with his troops. In the meantime, they're still fighting, but they've got things well in hand. And in fact, the battle is over. It's done. They've had no real shot. They had a lot of people, but they didn't have the weapons. The others had weapons, and they were well handled. A little bit about MacDonald. He was a lieutenant colonel at this point. He was the son of a Scottish crofter farmer. At 15, he joined the Scottish regiment. He was a particularly good soldier. He was in several battles. Eventually, he was in a battle that he was offered the choice of a Victoria Cross or a commission. He took the commission. Very well thought of. His troops were very well trained, and without question, most of the people connected with the battle thought that he should have been the major hero, certainly not Kitchener or others, but it should have been MacDonald. In the writing about this, and there's a huge amount written for a long time afterwards, there obviously the newspapers and everything, but then books and books and books and books. They all talk about how brave the Khalifa's troops were, how they kept charging and charging. They didn't have any chance, but they kept going. And this is talked about all the time. They were literally going to Allah, and obviously the British troops were happy to oblige them. A brief word about the 21st Lancers. They were formed after the Crimean War. They were in India. There were no battles for them. Their Confederates said your motto should be thou shalt not kill, because they never were in battle. They needed Tennyson in the charge of the Light Brigade. And anyway, they came over and they were there. They were sent out on reconnaissance mission number 1. They screwed up. They missed 20,000 people. It could happen to anybody. They then, on reconnaissance mission number 2, they were sent out to herd the retreating Khalifa's men into a group this way so that they couldn't get right to Khartoum or Omdurman. Instead, what happened was they wanted glory. If I had a motto of "Thou shalt not kill," I guess I would too. They saw a bunch of dervishes. They were fired on by the dervishes. Colonel Martin was angry, being fired on. He wheeled and he went after them. Oops! Hidden in a khor, a shallow depression, were 2,000 dervishes, not 300 to 500. They were brave, without any question. They charged straight through. A lot of bad things happened. They got on the other side. Martin apparently wanted to charge again. His other officers said no way, and they started using their rifles to good dispatch. 300 men. Astounding if you look at what happened in terms of the battle that we'll see figures coming up. The fact is, it was a huge charge, the last major cavalry charge of the British. A lot of people were killed. It really accomplished nothing, and yet there were more pictures painted, lithographs made of this than everything else because it was heroic. And to some extent, because of this man. He was a cavalry officer serving in India.
You lost your microphone? You know what?
Have I lost it?
Yeah, it's not working right now.
We can hear you.
Can you hear me all?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. I'll do it. And in any event, he wanted to go into action. He got his mother to secure him a job with the Daily Mail. She was rich, she was attractive, and effective. He went over, joined the 21st Lancers, even though he was not with them. Kitchener did not like him at all. He was courageous, he was in that charge, but because he was in that charge and a correspondent, he and others wrote about the charge. So that was written about as if that was the big part of the battle. It was a minor aspect of the battle, but it's the thing that many, many people know about, and they, of course, didn't have to have the motto, "Thou shalt not kill." The battle results, astounding. Even more astounding. They had more killed than, they had less killed than the cavalry. Now why? Because of firepower. They just had overwhelming firepower, and the Mahdists just kept charging. This never happened. They never got like this. These are not photos. These are lithographs, etchings, etc. The answer to this is, it's estimated that the vast majority of the dervishes Mahdists died at around 800 yards to 600 yards away from the front lines. That far away. Think of how many football fields that is. Over where the Sudanese were, the feeling was the closest they got was 300, and yet most people said maybe 600 there. So the fact is, they never really had a chance. And that was the end of the battle. Now this did happen. Kitchener went to Khartoum, raised the flag, and for Kitchener and many others, Gordon was avenged. You have to understand, this was a fellow officer, Gordon, Kitchener, and he felt strongly about this. He wanted him avenged. The Prime Minister and others had other things in mind, but he wanted him avenged, and he did avenge him. It took some years, but he did eventually do it. For the British public, probably the same thing. Gordon was avenged, let's have another one. So the chances are that as far as they were concerned, this was the major aspect. For the Mahdi, not so good. Kitchener decided he didn't want to have anything there that could make him a martyr, so he went in and took his bones out of the tomb and he strewed them around the desert. Not particularly nice thing to do. It was thought about 2 years after this, someone wrote about it, but by then he's a hero, he's untouchable, and no one made very much about it. But it did happen. The Queen issued a statement saying, "I am most happy." We're glad, of course, that she's happy. At this point, she's near the end, but she's happy. Now, for the Muslims, this ends for all time any threat of a Muslim uprising causing difficulties to the Western nations. End of story. We don't have to worry. Thank God for the Battle of Omdurman. Well, I guess we're a somewhat more sophisticated audience. What were the results? England established sovereignty over a country it didn't want, the Sudan. They did protect their bases along the Red Sea, and they protected the Egyptian border. Militant Mahdism was put on hold for a significant period of time. That was true. The slave trade, which was one of the big things that went on, because there were two types of Mahdists. There were the African Mahdists and the Arab ones. The Arab ones were selling many of the Africans into slavery. It was a significant bit of business. Egypt is stabilized. Turkey is weakened. Suez Canal is protected. British commerce continued unabated. And of course, they went down to Fashoda and kicked the French out, stayed in West Africa. So the English have accomplished most of what they wanted. It's gone very well. They win a battle they couldn't lose. They continue to think of battles as set pieces. The Boer War at the beginning did not go well for them. And of course, one of the obvious set pieces of all time is there. Kitchener, he's a hero. He has everything. And he should have won, but he did. He handled them well. He didn't go when he wasn't prepared, so he is a hero. They had not much. In the Boer War at the beginning, he did not do well because of the mobility. But he took care of that. He simply went in, took all the families, put them in concentration camps, burned their houses, burned their fields, total war, and they beat the Boers. You may wonder why in later years there was still hard feeling against the British. You know, because in the beginning of World War II, why didn't Jan Smuts immediately say, yes, we're with the British? That's probably why. But he then goes back to India, to Egypt, chief administrator, goes to India where he's the Sirdar again, and eventually is brought back around 1913. He becomes the Secretary of State for War. Great recruiting poster. Otherwise, not very good. He was not popular, did not get along with people. He did not have a number of new ideas. He was steeped in the past. 1916, on a British cruiser off Scapa Flow, very close, hit a mine. He and 722 others die. Interesting, he wrote to this, and one of the major newspapers in Birmingham wrote, Kitchener did the ultimate for his country. He had the grace to die because he no longer was useful. Kind of tough, kind of tough. Even worse for General MacDonald. Lieutenant Colonel, loved, good decision maker, becomes a major general. In several other wars, does well, goes to India, is sent to Ceylon, where he's the chief commander-in-chief. He runs afoul of rich planters and people of influence. Eventually, they spread rumors around that he has violated a number of young men. They come up with this incredible number of people who say, oh yes, he did. He goes back to England, facing court-martial, talking to friends. Most people said he seemed okay, but in 1903 he shot himself and killed himself. 5 years from Omdurman, all the way to there. Court-martial goes on, and then a commission, a civilian commission. At the end of this, after 2.5 years, they reached the conclusion that they thought he had been put upon by these rich people in Ceylon, and that what the charges leveled against him were not true. Obviously, the Army wants that. Obviously, the British want that. I don't know, to be honest, but in any event, an ignominious end and very sad for a man who was both loved and respected by his troops and his fellow officers. This man, most of you, I think, recognize the cavalry officer. It, of course, was Winston Churchill. As you know, his mummy was very rich, his mummy was very attractive, and his mummy did well by Winston. On the other hand, Winston did pretty well by mummy and the rest of the British Isles. So we know that at his very start, he was brave, and we know through the Boer War, WW1, etc. So we don't need to say any more about Winston. Now, the law of unintended consequences. Britain went there with certain things that they wanted to achieve. But look what happens. They have a base for World War I and Lawrence's Arabic success. There's no question that that is there and the reason that he's able to do what he did. But even more important is World War II with Rommel. If they hadn't had Egypt, he's at the Suez, he's at the oil, and he's coming up underneath the Russians, and we may be thinking very differently about World War II if they didn't have that. The Muslim activists were too weak to aid the Axis powers in both wars. The Germans tried very hard. They took the Grand Mufti, took him to Berlin, where he lived for about 11 or 12 months. So the law of unintended consequences were very, very important for the world, and who at that time could have foreseen that? But there's no question that that occurs. So, to remember, people fight furiously to protect their homeland. Fighting people who do not fear death is inimical to the Western world. We saw it here. Think about our troops fighting the Japanese in World War II. Think about what's going on now. Religious extremists are long-term and dangerous adversaries. And certainly everybody sitting here now thinks, of course, I know that. Santayana, those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. I have to be honest, I do wonder though, Britain fought 3 wars against Afghanistan. Russia fought 1 war. We are presently in the longest lasting war that we have ever been in, 2001 to 2017, and I still am not quite sure why we're there. I'm not sure that people that I know that are in power can remember Santayana. So, I will thank you for the pleasure of being here in Lexington, where there was another great battle that was fought and won, and thank you very much.
Okay. Questions? Is this on, Ed? No. Turn it on. We'd like you to speak into the mic for questions so that you'll be recorded. Thank you. Okay. Did you have your hand up? First question. I don't think it's on. One sec. You'll get the signal. Meanwhile, people with questions, raise your hand so I know to come to you. Okay.
You notice that
Tell me the question and I'll repeat it.
I guess so. Yeah, let's do that.
those troops were using Lee Enfield rifles. We used them at MIT when I was an ROTC student. They were heavy.
Yes.
Boy, they were heavy. They were good rifles.
Yeah. They just prior to that, I read that they were the Lee Metford at that time that they were using that had a 7 to 9 clip. But apparently they were very good, like the old Springfield. They shot well, you could depend on them, and of course you were able to fire 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which was the obvious big thing for them. Yes, sir.
So the casualties that the British inflicted on their enemies, were they mostly due to rifle fire, machine gun fire, or artillery fire?
The casualties that they inflicted were thought largely to be rifle fire as the most important aspect of it. The cannon fire went on for a period of time. Obviously, I'm in the wrong group, sorry. But the cannon fire was very helpful and certainly dissuaded them. But the thought was that it was the rifle fire that was so good. And all of the British troops were very well trained in that. And by the way, things I read said both the Sudanese and the Egyptians were good marksmen.
Okay, so the machine gun was really not a big factor.
The machine gun was a factor, but not as well, for one thing, because the Maxims were famous for jamming, particularly in the desert. Right. And there are several instances in which they talk about that.
Okay, thank you.
Back to the Suez Canal. When was it built and by whom?
It was built by a French engineer named de Lesseps, completed in 1867. Aren't you impressed that I actually know this? And 'cause I knew there'd be some guy that did. And the British actually bought it because the French handled it very poorly. And Disraeli, who was the British Prime Minister from 76 to 80, went and outbought stock in the stock company. And all of a sudden the French turned around and realized, oh my God, they own the stock. So that caused the British to then have that. And then at that point they kind of established a self-proclaimed protectorate of Egypt. And that's a very good question. Thank you.
So Kitchener set up his position on the banks of the Nile River. If the worst had happened and he had to retreat, could he have safely retreated?
No, he would have had a certain number that would have been on the gunboats. He might have been number one. But the fact of the matter is, he thought that what that prevented was them from coming around, swooping around, because he was very worried about the Baggara horsemen and so forth. So his idea was to do that. At the Nile in that area is actually fairly large, whereas the Atbara, where we were from Amudran, was not as big. But that was his concept, that he didn't expect to lose.
Now, do you think the adage of history repeating itself probably doesn't apply today, mainly because of the mass media, all the communications of the people? They can't be, everyone's aware of what's going on compared to the past, excluding Afghanistan.
So how can you exclude a place we're at war with?
Well, no, but we didn't have all that mass communication between the world. People now know what goes on. Almost they know more than our leaders do.
That wouldn't be hard. I'm not sure that, to me, a lot of the things that we think have gone are still there. I mean, the concept of intelligence being very important, and obviously one of the problems that we've had is having intelligence in all these various battles that we've had going on over in that area. And people don't change that much. Equipment does, etc. Easier to kill, etc. I think there are still factors that are still play, but they probably are more personal than the others.
It sounds like, it sounds like Churchill was only marginally involved in some of these battles, but how did the experience of these battles influence his decisions later on when he was more in charge?
I think Churchill was born a warrior. I mean, I think he wanted to be in the army. He wanted to go to the military academy. He wanted to do these things. Certainly no one can question his bravery because he takes part in the charge. He's a correspondent. He could have sat there and write about it and said, boy, that's a good charge. And instead, he takes part in the charge. He then goes, as you know, as a correspondent to South Africa, is captured, takes over some troops and gets off the train, does things. I mean, he is, in fact, a man, I think, is a warrior. I think basically that what he saw out of that from some of his writings is that training is hugely important, as he saw the fact that the British troops, particularly at this one time, because he was very critical of Kitchener, and that when the troops, the Lincolns go over, the Lewises come here, and the Sudanese wheel, and he realizes that training of troops is exceedingly important. So I think perhaps those are emphasis that he did. But I think he is a man who simply was born to be a brave man. My opinion.
More questions?
Yes.
Sir, I ran across a few years ago a book that I think everybody would like to read. It's about Churchill. A publisher commissioned his grandson to take 100 best speeches of Churchill and explain them, and it's a wonderful book. It's called Never Give In.
Never give in. Certainly that was him to do that. I was involved in orthopedics a lot and got involved in political aspect, and I gave my introductory speech about when I became president or something, and about we need heroes. And I basically spoke about Churchill, about the fact that, his heroics and his willingness to get out there, how much it meant to the British to lead like that. So I have to be honest that he is kind of my personal hero, and perhaps the fact that my father's family is English and comes there may have something to do with that. Like that. Probably.
His bust is in the White House again.
That's right.
Anyway, thank you very much. I enjoyed it.
Very happy.
Thanks.
Okay, and just as a
I want to
preview-
thank Ed too, by the way. He made it so I could do exactly what I wanted to do.
Oh, Ed's wonderful. Ed is our unsung producer in the booth. We couldn't run the programs without him. As a preview for next month, November 13, I believe, we have something really very interesting. we have a World War II orphan coming to talk to us, Walter Carter, who comes to our group quite a bit. Walter's father was a country doctor in West Virginia, and he got called up at the age of 39 or 40, was on the beach, was on Utah Beach at D-Day, and 12 days later was helping a wounded soldier and got killed by a sniper. And Walter was like 9 or 10 at the time. Didn't mean much, but years later, into adulthood, read letters from his father, said, I don't know this man, I really need to know him. Went on a lifetime search, wrote a memoir, wrote a book about his father, and spent his life questioning what the heck is this war all about? And has gone through, as many of you have, a whole series of what did World War II mean? And he started out with a very simplistic, well, it was the good guys against the bad guys, that's what it was, and came through the whole continuum to realize how much more sophisticated and how nuanced the meaning of the war was, and the effects of the wars, and how widespread it is. And he's a man who has thought and wrote